So I've seen at least a couple of people asking about why their Helldrake is terrible, or why their Hammerfall bunkers are pointed into the stratosphere. Let's talk about an unofficial but very present Games Workshop balance policy. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some trends in Warhammer 40k points updates. I'm sure many of you will be well aware of at this point, but I think that it's worth just underlining again, as I think it is worth bearing in mind when you're picking up models, just to set expectation for rules, even if that's only one part when you're picking up models, next to the cool looks and lore of course. Over the past few years in Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop have been refining their balance process. They've certainly tried some very different things, and it's actually not all that long ago that they've had the idea of the overall balance data slate, adding in rules changes to the game, and developing a more formal system for refining their points, updates dropping quarterly, and doing their best to generally explain their logic behind some of the changes from their Meta Watch videos. The normal idea at the moment is that armies that are weak get buffs, either rules or points decreases. Armies that are too strong and dominating the field tend to get nerfs, perhaps fixating on the strongest units around. And then within armies, units that are very rarely played tend to get points decreases, at least to aim for the vast majority of things being kind of playable. It does mean that in Warhammer 40k, there's a good element of things cycling around. Sure, your specific army or specific units might not be particularly great in this current meta, but there's every chance that come the next datasheet, unexpected things from your collection might suddenly be looking a whole lot better than they were. And while they keep doing this, it does maybe give players just a little bit more confidence just to build up the collections in armies and unit combos they just like the look and feel of, rather than repeatedly chasing the next flavour of the month. I think that's generally a fairly good place for the game to be in. There's definitely some things that have a bit more chance of getting better than others, certainly more iconic units for factions, like their core troops and their most elite soldiers, often tend to get more focus compared with some of the rest of the codexes. Some things certainly can get neglected. For example, Reavers, I feel like, despite having lots of rules changes and addition changes, still haven't really been particularly great ever since they came out. To go alongside these balance updates, they generally tended to offer no commentary whatsoever and just left that up to the community to see what they made of them and issue the points pages. Now at least we get a little bit of the thoughts of the design studio with the Meta Watch, who I do think are given maybe a little bit more of a hard time than they perhaps deserve, mostly saying at least fairly sensible things even if they're not wanting to be too self-critical as you can imagine for a company, and often being really quite vague in terms of what sort of things they are going to do later on with the balance updates, not wanting to set expectations and things before they decide to do something or don't for final. I have noticed though that in 10th edition and over the last few updates in general, it might seem to have acquired a few stealth policies though that they just don't really seem to focus on or tell people about so much. I'm sure many hobbyists who have been following them will be well aware of the one that I wanted to talk about today, but I think it is worth underlining for lesser engaged players who don't religiously follow every single points update or haven't been following along for the general trends. I did make a video on this a few months back, but with each passing data slate and points update, it does really just become more and more clear that Games Workshop are currently aiming for certain models in game to basically never get strong to the point where you might put them in a tournament list, and every time those units do reach that sort of height with consistency, they get slapped back by nerfs. Perhaps the best examples of those are flyers, so things like Helldrake, Storm Ravens, or Valkyries, fortification buildings like the Big Ed Boss Bunker, or the Webway Gate, or the Hammerfall Bunker. Any artillery with indirect fire has just been nerfed over and over again since 10th edition came out. I'd probably also add to that list any really big Titanic models out there. The plastic ones from Games Workshop's factions often tend to be a bit on the niche side, but they certainly seem to keep anything that's sort of like Titan scale to be making sure that that's niche and not the strongest thing in an army. Points cost that are really far above its actual overall value, even if it does have some impressive stat lines and guns with big numbers on them. So far in 10th edition we've had 3 balance passes, and their policy has generally been that if any of the above are commonly played in competitive lists, they get a points increase. I think it certainly goes above and beyond just trying to rein in the top factions with the strongest armies, as they still seem to get points increases even if the overall faction might be weak, and even if the unit in question is more considered to be well balanced and usable more so than actually overpowered, as I feel like people might be a bit more on board with overpowered units that are sort of dominating other choices for a faction being brought back into line, far more so than a unit that's just merely pretty good but not auto-include getting to be weak. It also seems to affect the other end of the spectrum as well. Generally, if any of these choices are super weak and basically never taken, then unlike the other choices in the game, they don't get any help. There are just a couple of exceptions, but for the vast majority of the Flyers' fortifications and indirect fire weapons, they haven't tended to get any points decreases since 10th came out. That's maybe most obvious for the things that are just crazily overcosted to the extent where you'd never consider them versus other units in the Codex or Index. Some things there's just clearly no effort being made to even make them kind of usable casually, let alone top competitive or anything like that. I think it is just worth being aware if you're someone who's thinking about picking up these miniatures. Obviously, rules are just one part of the decision as to whether or not you buy things or not if you're an active Warhammer gamer, but it still is one that's broadly important to a good number of people, knowing that the miniatures might at some point be alright in game, and perhaps good for tournaments and things, as well as just more friendly beer and pretzels type games in a more casual setting. This trend definitely seems to have been one that started at the start of 10th edition and has just carried on from there. Initially, when 10th edition came out, certain things were just kind of broken levels of strong. Indirect fire, admittedly, was one of those, whereas the most part flyers and things were just made very weak by the game's core rules. So it was maybe a bit more noticeable when Games Workshop hit a whole load of indirect fire weapons with big nerfs, whereas pretty much most of the flyers weren't in the place where they were causing problems or anything like that, so didn't get any sort of points or rules adjustments. At the start of the edition, we had nerfs to things like the Basilisks and the Eldar Night Spinners, though they needed more later. And we had a few first codexes coming out, such as the Tyranid Codex having the Harpy and Spore Assist, both points nerfed into oblivion, and the Space Marine one that had things like the Hammerfall bunkers getting a huge nerf, and Desolation Marines going up from all the way up to 120 points to 200 points per 5 of them around this time. And since then, despite being basically in the never played kind of category, they've never got any sort of small redress from this. Then moving on from there, I feel like it became very obvious that this was what they were doing in the January balance pass. Indirect fire units were squarely in the crosshairs. Things like the Exorcist, Plague Burst Crawler, Manticore, Whirlwind, and Eldari Night Spinner all went up in fairly significant amounts. I feel like the units being singled out for special treatment is maybe most notable when bad things happen to a usable unit for an otherwise really weak faction, say for example the Drukhari Void Raven. Prior to the balance update in January, Drukhari were one of the weakest armies in the game. Besides that one change, everything else was a points buff. It was just specifically the aircraft that Games Workshop said no to. That one went up in cost where everything else went down, and they got their fun new detachment. Then, for the more recent April points changes plus the recent codexes, they squarely went after the things that were most common staples in competitive armies. The Manticore, Basilisk, Medusa, and the Eldari support weapons were all nerfed. Some of the last really mainstream indirect damage dealers that saw really regular tournament play, even if a few on the above list are still kind of usable, things like the Exorcist and the Plague Burst Crawler maybe. Otherwise, maybe the only flyer that's seeing really regular tournament play at this point is the Space Marine Storm Raven, which is only being good due to being an Ironstorm Spearhead and being run alongside a Landspeeder Dark Shroud from the Dark Angels to make it overall tough enough. And despite Space Marines being arguably the weakest faction in the game right now, they decided that that one needed to go up by 20 points, despite it only being standout good in one formation, usually just for one chapter, and being kind of mediocre to bad for the cost everywhere else. The codexes definitely haven't tended to help out with things like flyers either. Orc flyers with their terrible bombing rules got no help at all in the Orc codex, though maybe a few of them are just kind of not too terrible with certain stratagems like Cult of Speed coming in from reserves, but they still don't really feel like they're an optimal choice. All at the same time of this, every single thing that has been clearly massively overcosted has got no help. Fortifications didn't really tend to start out at the start of 10th edition being particularly good, and things like the Eldari Webway Gates, the Orc Boss Bunker, and the Imperial Guard Aegis Defense Line haven't seen any sort of points changes, despite being basically unplayed competitively, even when other things in the faction have been addressed. And the same goes for several never played flyers such as the Burner Bomber, Harpy, Archaeopters, or Helldrake, all just considered super weak and stand out so for their points costs, always ranking towards the bottom of tier lists when I do them. And then when other things get fixed and sorted for their factions, these guys are left off the balance passes. Maybe the Archaeopters are a particularly notable one for the AdMech recently. Most of their other weak stuff got points decreases in their sort of tied over patch until they presumably get some sort of new rules coming up in that next data slate, but the Archaeopters were the only weak thing that seemed to be completely untouched. As for why they're doing this, as last time, I suspect that it's just literally a game design choice for how they want the game of Warhammer 40k 10th edition to play overall, or at least at a more top play competitive type level. I would admit that if any one of these classes becomes kind of dominant and the go-to thing for their army, the game can get into a bit of a weird state, judging by past editions. It seems that what they want to encourage is a lot of on-the-board units, sort of moving in and out of terrain and having big positioning and skirmishing type games, more so than any of these getting their own advantages in the battle. Flyers have definitely been one that have repeatedly caused problems in the past. Eldari fly spam was kind of the most horrific, I think, and completely uninteractive in 8th, though Admech and Orcs both had just some ridiculous flyer list builds that would just swoop up the board turn 1 and destroy everything. They often tend to be a unit where, when they make them just good enough to be interesting, they suddenly flip to being a good idea to spam them before it makes sense just to take one of them. Or at least that was true in the past when they could do big alpha strikes. I guess that's less the case now where they have to go into strategic reserve. Otherwise, indirect fire always gets a bit problematic when it's the best thing for an army, and armies wind up with multiple strong units that can delete enemies regardless of where they are on the board. It maybe doesn't help the entire movement and clever positioning sort of game that they probably want to have for 40k. And again, often if a little bit of it is worth it, then it can often be worth it en masse. For example, even after the Guard Manticore increased all the way up to 180 points last time, some people were certainly still finding it worth it to play 3 of the things, again often tending to be good in a bit of an all or nothing type thing, even if you are paying a big premium for the damage output. Just in general, when artillery has been extra good in the past, I feel like it's rarely been a positive match that people want to play against all that much. It means that the game boils down to a bit of trying to rush the enemy's artillery castle before they just delete you off the board bit by bit. It does feel extra punishing for armies that really rely on terrain to be able to protect certain key units. If you've got an army that really needs to focus on staying hidden and paying big value for expensive damage dealers that hide behind terrain and things, then if you run into an indirect fire army, that's probably going to cause problems pretty quickly. Otherwise, I feel like fortifications and really big titanic units just aren't the sort of thing that Games Workshop want at the centre of people's forces. Again, it's maybe less of an interactive or feel-good game if you're trying to invade a fortress town of the enemy that's set up in their own deployment zone. The bunkers and things will be only good if they're excessively tough and pretty dangerous. And really big titanic units, again, doesn't really look good if they're the best way to play an army. It was a bit ridiculous when I remember it was at one point a good idea to have the majority of the points in your army invested in something like an Eldar Revenant Titan, and then just have that thing stand on something like a Sky Shield landing pad and delete things. It's just maybe a bit more of a reductive game, even more so than, say, Imperial Knight skew lists. Overall, I think for those reasons, it seems to be Games Workshop's aim to keep these units somewhere between usable casually and maybe seeing some very niche playing competitive lists, though generally, if they get to be present in every list, they tend to get nerfs. But it looks like they really don't care if the units are actively terrible and basically worse than anything else in your codex. That isn't a cause for them to get boosted in that case. They're happy to leave them like that. I feel like for the overall gaming experience, it's probably good that they don't get absolutely massively overpowered, but I feel like it maybe is a bit of a problem and a bit sad for people who really like those miniatures and want to put them on the board without feeling too bad, ideally at the top level of play if possible. I feel like for quite a few armies, the flyers and artillery and things tends to be kind of niche and a supporting kind of role to the main event, but for some armies it is kind of iconic. I think the Astra Militarum are maybe a good example of that. The Guard Valkyrie has been one style that you could play in the past with sort of air cavalry sort of builds with scions, and artillery is something that the Astra Militarum is known for, kind of one of the 3 pillars of the Guard between infantry, artillery and big tanks. Maybe artillery having even more focus in 10th edition given that they get the best use of that Born Soldiers lethal hits rule. I feel like if Games Workshop could manage it, it'd be preferable if each thing could be actually good but not absolutely auto-include. I do think that it might be kind of hard to do without making the units be great to spam or basically take none of and not much in between. It might be good if maybe they went a bit harder into perhaps once per army per turn rules on the datasheets perhaps, or maybe some sort of scaling point system where if you had, say, the first flyer costing X amount and then the next one would cost you an extra 20 points to bring along. Though I guess that probably flies in the face of their ethos with trying to keep 10th edition points just ridiculously simple without war gear costs or anything. I do feel like certain units don't really need this sort of slightly draconian exclusion from all competitive play though. That Space Marine Stormraven I think was a fairly good example. Definitely strong in Ironstorm Spearhead, but that's arguably one of the best builds of a faction that doesn't have that many other options right now. And as it was being used as a centerpiece unit rather than en masse to just fly out and you can destroy the enemy army, it felt like it might have been one just not to have the points increase on it and buff other things if you want to encourage other play. Maybe for Chaos Space Marines, the Helldrake could be a good example of something that I think would be unlikely to cause that many problems. It'll move fast with the 20-inch move, but it does have kind of low damage and is more of an annoying disruption type unit than anything else. And low damage units like that might be the sort of thing that's more diminishing returns, and players might well be tempted just to take perhaps one or maybe two, rather than just going 3 or 0. I also do think that a fair few of the units that they just have pointed to ridiculous extremes could be brought down a little bit to make them a little bit more usable casually, even if they're still out of scope for competitive type lists. Lots of the fortifications feel like they're good examples of that. Things like the Webway Gates, the Chaos Demon fortifications, or the Hammerfall Bunker, just pointed in no way relation to what they do in game. Maybe certain flyers as well, like the Tyrannid Harpy. Feels like they could maybe be brave enough to drop the points on those a little bit, as I don't think they're in any danger of becoming competitive models without some kind of ludicrous points drops. In any case, let me know what you think. I just thought it was worth bringing up again, given that Games Workshop do seem to be doubling down on this rather than easing up on it as the edition goes on. It does maybe feel like one of the examples as well where their communication as to balance patches doesn't work quite as well. They'll happily tell us about a whole bunch of other stuff, but there's some topics like this that they just can't really mention that easily. They don't exactly want to annoy players by saying, yes, we've decided to keep all your flyers kind of bad for this edition. So kind of tough luck if you wanted to buy them and use them in competitive play. Obviously, it's not something that's necessarily set in stone as well. If they really wanted to, they could have a rethink and reintroduce certain flyers or artillery to the competitive game in a big way. But so far, by what they've done currently, it doesn't look like they're going to anytime soon. I guess we'll wait and see what the future shows there. In any case, let me know your thoughts. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new Warhammer 40k videos just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.